The biting winter of 1971 did not care about Hollywood schedules, nor did it care about the reputations of the men freezing in the high altitude of the Utah wilderness. Deep within the unforgiving valleys outside Provo, far beyond the comfortable safety net of studio soundstages and backlots, a battle of cinematic survival was unfolding. Robert Redford had envisioned something uncompromisingly raw when he pushed to bring this story to life. He did not want a stylized, crowd-pleasing Western filled with easy triumphs and polished heroes. He wanted the heavy, haunting truth of a Civil War veteran stepping into a mountain landscape he believed was empty, only to realize it had been deeply inhabited, revered, and saturated with human history for centuries before his arrival. Alongside director Sidney Pollack, Redford sought to strip away the myth of the romantic frontier. Yet, the corporate executives sitting in the warm, distant offices of Warner Brothers were anticipating an entirely different product. They wanted the legendary charm of the star from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid wrapped in a reassuring tale of rugged individualism, a story that would send audiences home comforted by familiar American myths. Instead, Pollack was quietly crafting a somber masterpiece about a man inflicting unintended damage on a world that offered no clean endings. The tension between artistic truth and corporate anxiety began to fester almost immediately on that frozen location. Warner Brothers had placed an official studio representative on the set, an observer tasked with monitoring the production and reporting any structural threats back to Los Angeles. Internal documents would later reveal that this representative grew increasingly alarmed by the film's ambiguous morality and its refusal to present a conventional hero. Pollack read these anxious dispatches but stubbornly kept his cameras rolling. There was, however, one pivotal sequence so volatile that Pollack refused to brief the studio on its existence, sharing the secret only with his trusted producer, John Calley. Knowing the studio would fight to the death to destroy the footage if they discovered it, Pollack engineered a brilliant distraction. He intentionally sent the studio representative 80 miles away to evaluate a completely useless secondary location. In that temporary window of absolute creative freedom, surrounded by the quiet gravity of the snow-covered peaks, the crew filmed the defining spine of the entire narrative. When the representative returned that evening, a wall of silence protected what had just been captured. What occurred during those secret hours of filming was not a flash of high-octane action, nor was it a sequence driven by dramatic orchestral music. It was a 7-minute stretch of deliberate, crushing silence set within a sacred crow burial ground. In this original version of the story, Jeremiah Johnson stumbles blindly through a resting place marked by signs that any man deeply attuned to the land would instantly recognize. But Jeremiah is not paying attention. He walks through it regardless, and the original cut of the film treated the consequences of that careless trespass with a devastating specificity. This was not a sequence built merely for atmospheric tension. The production had spent months collaborating directly with advisors from the Crow Nation, ensuring they were active architects of the scene's ultimate meaning. The consultants did not want their sacred ground utilized as a passive, exotic backdrop. They insisted on portraying it as a living, weighted space that had been systematically violated, legislated against, and dismissed by a century of American expansion. The sequence did something mainstream cinema of the era fiercely avoided. It looked directly into the camera and named the exact mechanism of dispossession. The dialogue openly linked Jeremiah's intrusion to deliberate federal treaty violations, framing the broken promises not as historical accidents, but as calculated political designs to clear the American West for white settlement. Jeremiah's trek across the sacred ground was stripped of any romantic innocence. It was presented as the tragic culmination of an erased history. Redford viewed this specific confrontation as the absolute soul of the project. He believed the film existed to interrogate the true cost of the mountain man myth, forcing audiences to question what happened to the indigenous communities when someone like Jeremiah claimed a populated homeland as empty, unclaimed territory. The reckoning arrived in late 1971 inside a cold, dimly lit screening room on the Warner Brothers studio lot. Pollack presented his initial assembly cut to a small panel of 8 powerful executives. As the final frames of the 7-minute burial ground sequence faded into the darkness, the room fell into a suffocating, hostile silence. There was no polite applause, no constructive creative feedback, and no routine industry note-sharing. One prominent executive silently pushed his chair away from the table and exited the theater before the lights even came up. The official memo he typed the following morning exposed the brutal reality behind their discomfort. This corporate rejection had nothing to do with standard editing concerns, pacing, or narrative flow. The studio spent decades wishing the document would remain lost to history because those hidden pages revealed that the truth on screen was deemed a direct threat to corporate security. In the weeks that followed, the studio shifted its tactics from quiet discomfort to bureaucratic pressure. When a studio objects to a film on purely artistic grounds, the resistance is loud, chaotic, and immediate. But the assault on the burial ground sequence was carried out through highly unusual channels, bypassing the Creative Affairs Department entirely and emerging directly from the legal division. The official arguments were intentionally mundane, claiming the film ran too long and that mysterious test audiences found the sequence confusing, a claim Pollack would later reveal was an outright fabrication since no public screenings had even occurred. The studio demanded trims, then a complete restructuring, and finally, total erasure. Pollack and Redford fought back with everything they had, arguing that removing the heart of the burial sequence would reduce their profound cinematic interrogation into nothing more than a shallow, hollow adventure story. The studio's resistance was driven by a deep fear of the political reality unfolding across America. Throughout 1971 and 1972, the American Indian movement was rapidly escalating its public campaign for sovereignty, forcing its way onto national television networks and demanding accountability for broken treaties and the desecration of sacred lands. The Nixon administration was locked in intense political warfare with these highly visible activists. For a major Hollywood studio to release a massive commercial film that explicitly validated indigenous legal grievances through a mainstream white protagonist was considered an unacceptable institutional liability. It was a narrative that lent immense cultural legitimacy to the very struggles federal authorities were actively attempting to suppress. The pressure on the filmmakers was immense. During a notable 1974 interview, a journalist asked Redford directly about the legendary missing footage. Redford delivered a response so meticulously guarded and evasive that the interviewer publicly labeled it the most deliberate non-answer of his career. Redford was forced to walk an impossibly thin line because the studio had established ruthless terms behind closed doors. The movie would receive full promotional backing and a major theatrical release on the absolute condition that the true nature of the censorship remained completely unspoken. The original, devastating sequence was systematically dismantled, compressed into a single, meaningless shot of a marker in the distant snow. The sharp dialogue, the legal reality of the treaties, and the profound contributions of the Crow advisors were wiped away entirely, leaving behind a beautiful but sanitized winter landscape. The indigenous consultants who had dedicated months to building the sequence were never granted the courtesy of an explanation. They discovered the erasure only when they sat in the theater to view the final, compromised release. Decades later, a historical researcher examining government and Hollywood censorship uncovered the definitive proof buried deep within the studio archives. A legal memo dated December 1971 addressed to the senior production committee laid out the unvarnished truth in chillingly precise corporate prose. The document explicitly stated that the burial ground sequence was legally inadvisable given the current federal climate. It proved the studio had been tracking and targeting this message from the very first day of shooting, using their on-set representatives to ensure the final product did not challenge the preferred historical narrative of the state. Sidney Pollack ultimately surrendered to the cut, not out of weakness, but because he knew the studio would simply strip the film from his hands and alter it even further if he walked away. Yet, the loss left a permanent scar on his creative soul. In his final extended interview before his passing, Pollack confessed that erasing the true Crow burial sequence was the single deepest regret of his professional life. It was not a standard creative compromise, it was a total capitulation to political censorship. For over 50 years, generations of film lovers have praised a cinematic classic, entirely unaware that the version they love is not the profound story the creators actually made, but merely the safe, quiet version Hollywood permitted them to see.